Ladies and gentlemen, and dear panelists, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this panel on the Syrian refugee crisis. My name is Yasemin Mohammad. I'm an assistant professor in the German department, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I wanted to take a few minutes of your time. First of all, I would like to thank the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany in Washington, D.C., without whose support this panel would not have been possible. Secondly, I would like to thank the German Department, the Division of World Languages, Literatures and Cultures, the European Studies Group and International Programs, and Iowa City Public Library for their support. I would like to thank Consul General Herbert Quelle, Nell Gabiam, and my colleagues Ahmed, Souaiaia and Elke Heckner for your willingness to participate in the panel. And last but not least, I would like to thank you all for coming. The Syrian refugee crisis is one of the largest humanitarian crises since the end of the Second World War. An estimated 11 million Syrians have fled their homes since the outbreak of the civil war, which started from March 2011 on. Now more than 13 million are in need of humanitarian assistance within the country. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, 6.6 million Syrians are internally displaced, and 4.8 million have fled to Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, and Iraq. Turkey continues to host the highest number of displaced Syrians at nearly 3 million. In Europe, Germany admitted the majority of Syrian refugees in 2015 and 2016. The Syrian displacement, Syrian displacement can be considered a game changer on the world stage. The world is watching Syria for far more closely than any other violent conflicts and refugee situations, and as a result, a greater number of actors are involved. The war and displacement of refugees still preoccupies a significant part of powerful states' foreign policy priorities. Scholars and policymakers are re-evaluating the broader global refugee regimes, and new ideas and approaches have been tested. In this panel discussion, we will approach the Syrian displacement through an interdisciplinary approach and address questions such as, so what are the politics and consequences of the Syrian refugee crisis? How can we understand and approach the Syrian refugee crisis from multiple perspectives, the ethical, the political, the economic, and the cultural? How are Germany and Arab countries responding to the crisis? How should they respond? What are the international rights of refugees and asylum seekers, and what are our responsibilities? What is daily life like for Syrians in Germany, for example? And how has the Syrian refugee crisis influenced and transformed the global refugee regime? Now I would like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Nell Gabiam. She's an associate professor of anthropology and political science at Iowa State University. She's the author of The Politics of Suffering, Syria's Palestinian Refugee Camps, which was published in May 2016 by Indiana University Press. While her earlier research focused on the politics of humanitarian aid in Palestinian refugee camps, her more recent research focuses on Palestinians displaced by the ongoing Syrian war and has taken her to Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, France, Sweden, and Germany. Please welcome Nell Gabiam.
Thank you, Yasemin, and thanks for organizing this panel. It's a pleasure to be here. So good afternoon. I'm basically going to talk about how the current refugee crisis has impacted global refugee policy. So one could argue that the Syrian refugee crisis is currently the most globally visible refugee crisis. The numbers, 5 million Syrians displaced across Syria's borders, partly account for this visibility, but there are other reasons for it. Syrian refugees emanate from a region of political and geostrategic importance to the West, and especially the United States. Additionally, by summer 2015, the refugee crisis, or the Syrian refugee crisis, reached Europe's doorsteps. And even though Syrians crossing into Europe represent a small fraction of the Syrian refugee population, they have elicited disproportionate media interest and become the center of heated debates about the responsibility of European countries to welcome them, their ability to integrate in those countries, and also the extent to which they might or might not pose a security risk. So given the staggering numbers of Syrian refugees and their global visibility, it's perhaps not surprising that Syrian refugees are also particularly visible in current attempts to reform global refugee policy. And so not only have proposed reforms been inspired by the situation of Syrian refugees, but attempts to implement these reforms have also largely focused on them. And so one of the main issues I will talk about is this attempt to lessen the divide between emergency aid and development. Humanitarianism and development have become increasingly intertwined in the response to refugee crises. At an ideological level, this shift can be traced all the way back to the 1980s when it became very evident to African states hosting refugees that refugee situations were becoming increasingly protracted. And so these states called upon the United Nations to implement development programs that would compensate them for hosting refugees over the long term, and at the same time would promote refugee self-reliance pending their return to their home countries. UNHCR, which is the office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee, was receptive to this call, and through cooperation with African host countries such as Chad, Angola, Ethiopia, Zaire, now Democratic Republic of the Congo, Uganda, Burundi, set in motion a series of development projects in these host countries. By 2005, UNHCR had come up with the Development Assistance for Refugee program. This program was premised on the idea that given the increasingly protracted nature of refugee crises and the incredibly small number of refugees who end up being resettled in third countries, the percentage is 1% basically of all refugees will end up being resettled in a third country. It didn't make sense to continue to address refugee crises as temporary emergencies, and that development needed to be part of the response to these crises and should be incorporated into the national development plan of host countries. And so how do Syrians fit into this, or Syrian refugees specifically? Well, the development projects that were initiated in the 1980s in the African countries mentioned earlier failed, and the development assistance for refugee program never really took off in terms of becoming a concrete program that was being implemented on the ground. And so by the early 2000s, these efforts at emphasizing development in response to refugee crises kind of fizzled until the emergence of the current Syrian refugee crisis. In the aftermath of this crisis, UNHCR returned to the ideas that had informed its attempted policy shift in the 1980s. It became involved in the Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan, also called the 3RP, which is a plan that centers on Syrian refugees and seeks to provide development as well as humanitarian assistance to these refugees, emergency humanitarian assistance. So I'm just going to talk about some of the features of this plan and then kind of talk about its impact on global refugee policy. So the Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan, it's a regional plan whose implementation began in 2014, and it seeks to provide a coordinated response to the Syrian refugee crisis in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, and Egypt. So basically the main Middle Eastern host countries. It involves 200 humanitarian and development partners, including governments, UN agencies, and international NGOs. It's led by UNHCR, so the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees, and UNDP, the United Nations Development Program. It seeks to address the immediate needs of refugees fleeing Syria, but also to provide what they call livelihood support to communities where refugees have fled. And this is where development comes in. One of the major ideas behind this is that, that communities where you have a large number of refugees are going to be impacted by this. And so when you're thinking about addressing the situation through development, yes, you should focus on the refugees, but also on the community as a whole. And so, that development should benefit the refugees, but also the host community in general. And that's why there's been an attempt to involve host countries in these development projects. So the Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan also talks about entering formal agreements about job creation for refugees with the international community, which would be a way to allow Syrian refugees to have access to the private sector, which would then allow them to start small and large businesses. The plan also talks about enabling Syrian refugees to provide services to other Syrian refugees. So instead of having NGOs, humanitarian organizations, or host states provide all the services, have Syrians themselves be employed in that way. And I think, with regard to employment, sort of at a practical level, sort of being talked about as a matter of fact, right? The refugees should have access to work. I think that represents a fundamental shift in terms of recent shift, in terms of, they might have that right if you look at international law, but in terms of talking about it as something that needs to be implemented, it really, I think, represents a shift from viewing refugees primarily as recipient of aid to as people who have a right to work. The Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan also recognizes that a majority of Syrian refugees, 80%, are living outside of camps. And so really, pushes for refugees living in camps as well as those living outside of camps, who are basically the majority in the Middle East. So those settled in urban, peri-urban, or rural areas to also have access to assistance and protection. And here again, I think you have a fundamental shift, again, that I think has occurred in recent years, where encampment is no longer seen as a requirement, basically, for refugees to receive assistance. And it certainly shouldn't be, if refugees have chosen to self-settle, for example, in urban areas. And so the Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan appears to have had a direct impact on global policy, on the global policy and aid, global refugee policy environment. And it's something that has been acknowledged by Filippo Grandi, who is the head of UNHCR, and Helen Clark, head of UNDP, the two organizations that are kind of leading this resilience plan. Both Clark and Grandi note that the idea of supporting national systems and working in partnership with local responders, so again, involving host states, host communities in the response to refugee crises, that has now become widely accepted. They also note that in the aftermath of the adoption of the Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan, various donor countries have pledged to create 1.1 million jobs for refugees, and that private sector actors have signaled their willingness to provide new investments that would benefit refugee communities. Another impact of the Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan is that it has inspired a series of international meetings focused around reforming the global refugee system. One of the earlier ones was the Global Responsibility Sharing meeting in Geneva in March 2016. And this meeting was basically to find new pathways for facilitating the resettlement of Syrian refugees in third countries. And even though it was specifically about Syrian refugees, part of the discussion was also about making resettlement more accessible for refugees. I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that currently only 1% of all refugees end up being resettled. During the talk, High Commissioner Grandi actually proposed that percentage be raised to 10%. Another meeting that was inspired by the Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan is the World Humanitarian Summit that took place in May 2016 in Istanbul. And many of the themes of the Regional Refugee and Resilience Program appeared at this summit. So closing the humanitarian development divide, promoting refugee resilience through education, sustainable livelihoods, employment, addressing the fact that the majority of Syrian refugees live in cities and not in camps. All of those themes were core issues that were discussed at the World Humanitarian Summit, which is, according to the organizers, was basically the main goal of it was to commit to new ways of working together to save lives and reduce hardship around the globe. And so again, you see how policies that were directed specifically at Syrian refugees are sort of being adopted now at a more global level, or at least discussed at a more global level. Another meeting is the United Nations General Assembly Summit for Refugees and Migrants in September 2016, and which also inspired by the Syrian refugee crisis. And that was basically a meeting that was organized to address large movements of refugees and migrants with the aim of bringing countries together behind a more humane and coordinated approach. And at this meeting, the focus of the meeting was responsibility sharing, that states, do their part more equitably so that there's a better outcome for refugees. So those are some of the ways that the Syrian refugee crisis is having an effect on global policy. I just want to mention here also that even academics have been chiming in to this debate. And so a book that recently came out, 2017, this year actually, it's written by Alexander Betts and Paul Collier, who are both at the University of Oxford. Betts is a political scientist, Collier is an economist. And the book is titled Refuge, Rethinking Refugee Policy in a Changing World. And the data on which their arguments are based draw mostly on the Syrian refugee crisis, and specifically a trip that they took. They were invited by the Jordanian government, which is hosting a pretty large number of Syrian refugees, I think almost 2 million. And so they were invited to help the Jordanian government think about ways that it could more efficiently address such a large presence of Syrian refugees in the country. And so the book's arguments can be basically summarized as follows. But the book starts with that situation, but then kind of provides these sort of broader recommendations. The existing refugee system, administered primarily by UNHCR, this is their own words, is antiquated, out of touch with the current refugee experience, and needs to be replaced by something new. Another argument is that encampment is counterproductive. It's a counterproductive way of addressing refugee situations. It's dehumanizing. It renders refugees completely dependent on aid and prevents them from moving on with their lives and becoming productive members of host societies. They also mention that over half of the world's refugees live in cities, meaning that UNHCR needs to provide assistance and protection to refugees who have self-settled in cities and not just those who are in camps, and has to figure out ways of reaching those refugees who are self-settled. And then a big theme is that refugees need employment. That it is dehumanizing for them to be dependent for extended periods of time on aid and to be isolated from society and living idle lives in camps. And so a specific solution that they propose within the Jordanian context is that apparently Jordan has these free trade zones, that were built, I guess, in the last few years, and they're actually having a hard time finding Jordanians who are interested in working there, and so they've sort of made this proposal to employ Syrian refugees, and apparently that's something that's being implemented. So, what to make about these debates or these reforms or attempted reforms that have been set in motion in the global sphere and are also now being discussed in the academic sphere. So even though I agree with the idea that the current refugee regime does need reform and that refugees should not be perceived primarily as helpless recipients of aid, but as agents who want to get back to normal life as soon as possible, and that absolutely includes employment, I think that these proposed reforms also should not be taken for granted and deserve some scrutiny. And since I don't have a lot of time, I'll just give a few thoughts, but then we can maybe have a deeper discussion if there's time for questions. So I worried that the significant emphasis that is being put on development as a means of ensuring rapid refugee integration in host countries might come at the expense of a more encompassing, diverse, complementary set of solutions that would more fully address the real obstacles faced by refugees. For example, a focus on development in the host country, and keep in mind that most host countries are located in the global south, so 85% of all refugees are actually in the global south, not in the north, that a focus on development might become a way for countries in the global north, who tend to be much wealthier, to avoid taking on their share of responsibility toward refugees, especially in terms of contributing to providing resettlement or asylum to refugees. Another issue which has been extensively documented by development scholars, is that development plans may look very good on paper, but it doesn't always mean that they will necessarily work in practice. And nor does development have a very good track record of lifting masses of people out of poverty. And so specifically with regard to free trade zones, I think it's telling that Jordanians themselves don't seem interested in working in them. And they also have been the subject of a lot of documentation in terms of the kinds of exploitative practices that tend to happen towards workers. And so I think it's important to think about, when we're thinking about employing for refugees, I think it's important to be careful not to fall on solutions that basically would turn them into a cheap and even more exploitable source of labor than citizens. So while the focus on a more developmental approach toward refugees is overall a positive one that at least in theory reduces the gap between refugees and citizens, one that I think also perhaps does more to recognize refugees as agents in their future, agents of their future well-being, I think that this policy shift should be complemented by others. So it's not necessarily that it's a bad idea, but I think it might be a little too reductive to think only in terms of development. So, for example, in addition to a more developmental approach, I think there should be a commitment from countries in the global north to increase the numbers of refugees that they currently resettle, and that was proposed at one of the meetings that I mentioned, and also to make it easier for refugees to seek asylum in the global north. And I think there were efforts, but again, in relation to the Syrian refugee crisis, I think in 2015, when Germany opened its borders, I think it assumed that other states would follow suit, and there were discussions about different countries sort of committing to a certain quota in terms of accepting refugees, but it doesn't seem like that has actually translated any kind of firm policy. So I think those are things that need to be also pushed, in addition to talking about development in the global south where most refugees are located. I also believe, as pointed out by a recent policy brief that was published by the University of Oxford, that refugee self-reliance goes beyond employment and development and economic indicators. That self-reliance is also about finding a sense of self-fulfillment, and that's connected more to psychological, emotional well-being. And so policymakers should be looking at well-being and emotional, psychological, social well-being sense, as well as just economic independence and stability. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Our second speaker today is Elke Heckner. She's a lecturer in the Department of German at the University of Iowa. She's writing on the memory cultures of the Holocaust and the Armenian genocide. She's especially interested in the question of how we write in the present, what our collective responsibility as upstanders is in our tumultuous time.
Okay, so I just got moved up, I noticed. So I'm actually interested, can you hear me? Okay, so I'm interested in talking about a group of ethnic Armenians that are either invisible or that get so exploited by right-wing groups or policy, and these are Syrian Armenians who have experienced with the Syrian refugee crisis a kind of double displacement. Now, Syrian Armenians are mostly descendants of the Armenian genocide, of survivors of the Armenian genocide, mostly women that were either incorporated into Syrian households. So this population group in particular has settled around the city of Aleppo, which you may be familiar in the news. About 60,000 Syrian Armenians lived in Aleppo. Some of them lived in areas around the Syrian desert where they originally were driven to by Ottoman Turks in 1915. And these border cities, these cities in the desert, such as Assoc, Deir, Assoc, and Raqqa have all been taken by ISIS, and these cities and communities have been now entirely depopulated. In Raqqa in particular, ISIS has sort of like declared several churches and has turned them into their, when ISIS still was around in that part of the country, has basically declared them into sort of like headquarters of the Islamic State. Okay, so having mentioned that, I think an important issue to raise is, the question of what's the status of potential, what are the possibilities of cohabitation and coexistence of different minorities, ethnic groups, religions, in Syria, post-Syria, in the Middle East. And, while I have a lot of trouble with the kind of right-wing politicization that these groups have experienced, I'm also equally concerned about sort of like the eradication of, cultural heritage that has gone back quite a bit. Armenians are so like very old, so like Christian population, much like the Yazidis, and I do think this issue of double displacement also deserves some attention now. A lot of Syrian Armenians have fled to Lebanon, where they join a huge, already pre-existing refugee population. Some have, about 30,000 have actually returned to the Republic of Armenia, which is an economically incredibly deprived country that is on the border with Turkey. Turkey keeps a close border, trying to starve Armenia off economically. This is still like a spillover effect of the entire discussion whether Armenia wants or does not want to acknowledge that something like the Armenian genocide happened, right? So, and I'm especially taken by your question, how do host countries that may not have an appropriate infrastructure, how do they receive actually development help? And, while in this case, there is a very, powerful, especially also in this country, a very powerful, I guess, American Armenian diaspora in place, it's not always clear, whether those who are actually in need and who return to either Armenia or to Lebanon or try to hang on to make life livable still where they are in Syria, whether they get the help we need. I do want to, I think it's also really important to think about, is there a future for sort of like a different of cohabitation and coexistence of different religions, and what would that look like? And maybe projects could also address that. And that's what I have to say for now. Okay.
Our third speaker today is Herbert Quelle, Consul General of the Federal Republic of Germany in Chicago. Consul Quelle joined the Federal Foreign Office, then still in Bonn, in 1980. His posting abroad includes Los Angeles, Pretoria, Havana, Warsaw, London, Baku, and Boston in various functions. Consul Quelle served as ambassador in Baku from 2010 to 2013. His attachment to the Consulate General in Boston was combined with a fellowship at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs of Harvard University. And Herbert Consul Quelle has been in Chicago since July 2014.
Thank you. It's great to be back at this university. It's only about a month that I was here last with Elena Restein, part of the program that you're enjoying also today, Campus Weeks. And I think the subject that you picked, Yasemin, is very worthwhile, and the attendance of it shows that there is appreciation, the possibility to get this get more information on it. I've been asked to speak on this subject mostly on two aspects. Mostly what was the perception of the refugee crisis, especially Syrian component, let me put it this way, in it in Germany, and what has been the effect on the elections, and give you a little bit on the perspective of how the German government may handle the refugee issue. First, it needs to be stated that Germany does not have an immigration policy on the federal level. It's not regulated in any way like the immigration policy of the United States, of Canada, or of many other countries. I think it will be one issue, and not such an easy one, for the new government that is about to be formed. This will not happen before the end. I mean, the formulation of the policy will not happen before the end of the year, but the government should be formed before the end of the year, and then in the current legislative period until September, October 2021. I'm quite optimistic we should have an immigration policy. The second thing I want to initially point out is that, and that was in the introduction by Yasemin, Germany was and is the country within the European Union that, as far as the entire number is concerned, quantity is concerned, has been most welcoming of all the European Union member states. You can argue whether some smaller countries have taken in proportionately as many refugees as Germany, and initially that was the case for Sweden and for Austria. Whether that is still the case today is a question to be debated. You will find out, by the way, that the figures are terribly imprecise. Even the official figures that we have in Germany should be taken with a grain of salt. But there are some numbers that one needs to just take into account that are pretty much not disputable. And the latest figure that has been given for refugees in Germany over the past 3 years is 1.6 million. 1.6 million. That's a huge number. And the Syrians in this group are at least 500 million, and maybe more than that. And I think, 500,000, sorry, half a million, 500,000, of course. And I believe they are more. And that actually goes back to 2013, when the first war refugees came to Germany. 2013, 2014, at least 150,000. Probably 200,000, maybe even 250,000 at that time. You just, as Americans in the room, need to juxtapose that with the size of this country, with the population of this country, 4 times more the population than Germany, and the Muslim percentage that you have in this country is about the same. You have the total number is about the same that we have in Germany. We have 3 to 3.5 million Turks who are in the majority Muslims. If you add at least 500,000 Syrians to that, and many other refugees for various reasons who have come from mostly Muslim countries, probably another million. In the United States, you have around 3.54 million. So the density of Muslims, if you permit that comparison, the density of Muslims is 4 times higher in Germany than it is in the United States. And we do not have a discussion that you have in the United States of comparing an immigrant, migrant from a Muslim country with a terrorist. You have that in a small fringe section of policy, but not as a major policy discussion issue. And that's a huge, it's a huge difference. Needs to be taken into account. When I say we do not have a immigration policy, that is important for the situation in 2015, when in September, tens of thousands crossed the borders into Germany without having been vetted, without having been selected, simply by the pressure that emanated from the countries of people who had already reached the European continent and who had been walking by foot or in car sharing or on trains or what have you, but certainly not by plane. That would have made a control much easier. Migrating through the Balkans, then the Balkan route, as you may recall, was closed, and they were looking for other ways, but 10,000 to 15,000 for weeks arrived at Munich Central train station. And if you imagine the network on the ground that is necessary to handle such large numbers of migrants, there are certainly relief organizations in Germany, like you have in any country, Red Cross and Caritas and what have you. They would not have been able to handle these masses without the support of hundreds of thousands of volunteers who jumped in and who helped distribute food, distribute clothing, look for makeshift housing in the first days, build up shelter in gyms of universities and of schools, high schools, primary schools, and what have you. There was a wave of sympathy by a large group of the population, a majority, who carried Angela Merkel's policy. Angela Merkel, the former head of government and possible future head of government, at least after the elections of 24th of September. She's charged with, as the chairwoman of the largest party, with sounding out the chances for forming a coalition. When she had said, wir schaffen das, we will manage, and had proclaimed a welcome policy, she was supported not only by the majority within her party, but by a majority of the German populace. And that was connected with at least one major promise of her side. She said, this will be our policy because we feel bound by the Geneva Refugee Convention. We need to meet our obligations. And we have rights of our constitution, but also we have the value-based system that we all share within the European Union. So her hope was that this policy would be adopted and not only accepted but also adopted by our neighbors. And she ran into big difficulties with most of the European Union member states. We had in November 2015, for the first time, a majority decision by the European Union Council where most of the countries voted against the countries Poland, Hungary, Slovak, and Czech Republic, the so-called Visegrad countries, by obliging them to take a certain quota that had been mentioned, I think, in your contribution, Nell, just now. And there was a decision that about 140,000 people should be distributed according to a certain key, and this country should take so many, that country should take so many. Since then, only my latest figure is 2,500 of 140,000 have been distributed. Because countries like Poland and Hungary said, well, we are a Catholic country, we won't take any Muslims. That's the reason why I made the point earlier about we have to talk about the acceptability or the acceptance of Muslims in this context also. And that drives us, as I said, or brings us into a quagmire or dilemma rather, situation. In that, in my interpretation, it's part of the explanation for the loss of quite a few percentage points of the governing Christian Democratic Union party of Chancellor Merkel, that she could not implement her promise to the electorate that there would be solidarity among European Union countries. So when we analyze why has the Alternative für Deutschland, the alternative for Germany, suddenly reached almost 13% on an anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, and xenophobic, racist, occasionally also anti-Semitic ticket, that has to some extent to do with the fact that solidarity within the European Union could not be achieved. And the question that comes into play here is, to what extent in an organization like the European Union, which remains a body of sovereign states who have come together and only have given away part of their sovereignty, but they remain as sovereign entities, to what extent can you implement a value system to which all have subscribed if these members violate the value system? And to what extent does a member like Germany, who wants to implement values, does it have to at one stage admit, well, we can't implement that, then at least we will have to preserve the cohesion of the European Union, because that might be the sacrifice in the end. And I would presume, and that would bring us into a very complicated other questions, I would presume in the end the value-based approach might suffer more than the cohesion-based approach. It might be that I agree that one of the greatest challenges we are all facing is the global refugee crisis, and the UNHCR and OIM have lately revised upwards their figures. It used to be 65 million. Now we're talking globally about almost 70 million people counting as refugees. So that is a huge challenge, and we have to, as far as Germany is concerned, we have to note that Mrs. Merkel has not given up her initial policy of not fixing a ceiling to how many refugees Germany should take in. Although she has been under tremendous pressure from her, more so than from anybody else, from her sister party, another party that carries the Christian in its name, Christian Social Union from Bavaria, which 1 week after the elections, got sat together with her, and they came out with a compromise which is pretty close to what one of the potential members of the new coalition has developed, namely the Free Democratic Party. They have said we have to differentiate 3 categories. That would be the war refugees, which encompasses the Syrians. That would be the political asylum seekers, or those seeking asylum for other reasons, being persecuted on religious or racial grounds. And there would be a column, as it were, of economic migrants. And as far as the economic migrants are concerned, a figure of 200,000 is in the, let me put it this way, in the room, as it were. And the others should not be fixated with a ceiling. So I think that could lead us, if the migration pressure from countries in the south, as you said, remains, and it will remain, that gives us a lot of leeway to be flexible upwards. But realistically speaking, if you have a country the size of Germany that certainly needs labor, qualified labor, more than anything else, there is a stress on the population that can probably not be overcome. So it's an increasing stress that cannot be overcome so easily. We are one of the richest countries in the world. We are one of the richest countries in the European Union. But still, people would say, if we are the only ones who have to do this, we are sick and tired of it. We do no longer want to be the good example. We have to think of ourselves first. So that's basically the philosophy that I see for the next years to come, and also the framework around the mood in which the government is now, or the possible coalition is now being negotiated.
Thank you very much. Now, I would like to discuss today, I would also like to go on with Germany and look at the ways in which Germany and the German government, the federal government, and maybe the states are trying to integrate the refugees, Syrian refugees, into the society. I prepared a short also PowerPoint. I'm going to show some statistics and facts here. So Germany hosts the largest number of also Syrian refugees in Europe, and also it received the largest number of refugees in the year 2015 and 16. As you can see in these figures, in 2015, around 890,000 refugees were admitted to Germany, not only from Syria, but also the second largest refugee community is from Afghanistan, actually, but also from Iraq and Iran, Somalia, and Eritrea. So these are the countries. And the numbers dropped to 280,000 in 2016 due to the agreement made with Turkey in 2016. And so now that if refugees, let's say Syrian refugees who are in Turkey try to cross the border, Greece, first of all, and other countries they have to return them to Turkey back, and because of that there is a drop in the numbers of 280,000, but still in 2070, the numbers are not, as we have kind of around 69,000 or 70,000 refugees entering Germany now, and there are more than 500,000 Syrian refugees in Germany currently. While at first in the German and European public sphere, discussions focused on for sure, the immigration policies and perspectives of host countries, the priority now has shifted to longer-term economic, social, and cultural integration of refugees. Now, refugee integration is a comprehensive and challenging task with many interconnected dimensions, from providing emergency shelter and longer-term housing to enabling access to healthcare, or from including children in public education schemes to facilitating adults' initial access to employment and participation in the labor market. And there are many other, for sure, constituents in this. It is important that not only, state administrations, but also non-governmental organizations cooperate with each other in fostering the inclusion and longer-term integration of refugees and asylum seekers. In this presentation, I will focus on three important areas. The first one is I will talk about Germany's the language aspect and the cultural integration aspect. And the second area I'm going to discuss is the labor market and the employment opportunities for the refugees. And the third area I'm going to focus on is education, but I'll focus more on the university education for the refugees. Now, being able to speak the language of the host country and knowing how the society works are of key importance to integration, and it also accelerates employment for sure. Already in October 2015, when large numbers of asylum seekers started to arrive in Germany, integration courses, job search assistance, and job intermediation services, vocational language courses were made available to asylum seekers from countries, for asylum seekers from countries with high recognition rates. I would like to emphasize that, because now there are countries which are considered safe, and the list is getting bigger actually. In Germany, for example, let's say asylum seekers from other European countries, let's say Albania or Kosovo, those are now considered safe countries, and they are not those asylum seekers, refugees are not, allowed to, participate in these language courses. So on August the 6th, 2016, the Integration Act and the regulation on the Integration Act entered into force in Germany. The Integration Act and the regulation amend several laws in order to facilitate the integration of refugees into German society. The Integration Act provides that waiting periods for integration classes will be reduced from the current 3 months to 6 weeks, and that the number of integration classes offered will be increased as well. In addition, integration classes will place a larger emphasis than was the case before on communicating values that are essential to German society, or how, let's say, a democratic civil society works. There's more emphasis on that now. And those asylum seekers who actually refuse to take part in an integration course or who do not meet their duties to cooperate will have their benefits curtailed, actually. So each, I would like to now show you how each integration course works here now. Each integration course consists of a language component and an orientation course. And first of all, a placement test is taken at the beginning of the course, and then the language component, the normal one, the standard one, comprises 600 hours of instruction, and the goal is that the refugees and asylum seekers reach B1 level, and B1 level is enough for some jobs. Although if you want to study at the university or want a different job, like if you want to become a professor or work at, in a different areas, C1 level is required as well. But the basic one is B1. The integration course, there's the other component, there's the integration course, and that takes only 60 hours to complete. And some of the important topics in the orientation course are first of all, the German legal system, for example, history and culture of Germany, rights and obligations in Germany, ways of coexisting in society, and important values in German society, such as, for example, freedom of worship, tolerance, and equal rights. And also, I mean, other special courses are offered for, refugees and asylum seekers as well, especially, for example, if, some of the refugees do not know how to read and write, in that case, more courses are offered, and it takes a longer time for like 900 hours or more to complete a course. So on the 1st of July 2016, the foundation expanded the range of vocational language promotions available for people with a migration background. So vocational German language promotion became a standard instrument of the Federation's language promotion. It's implemented by the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees and builds directly into the integration courses. So in 2016, the federal government, for example, funded 100,000 seats in job-related language training courses for the refugees. Now, incorporating refugees into Germany's workforce is also vital to mitigating the social and economic impact of the crisis. The extent to which refugees are allowed to work in Germany depends on their actually particular immigration status. So refugees that have been granted political asylum, however, are generally entitled to seek employment without restrictions in Germany. Despite this formal access to employment, for sure, I mean, labor market integration of refugees remains challenging. Some of the percentage of employed persons among refugees is, I mean, the employed percentage is still very small among the refugees. And one of the biggest problems for sure is that most of the, let's say, if you look at the Syrian refugees, for example, they don't know German when they first arrived. They didn't know German, so it takes a long time to reach actually B1 or B2 level, and then they have to, complete the integration course and then vocational, maybe language courses, and that's why it's going to take a long time for the majority of the asylum seekers and refugees to be integrated into the job market in Germany. Now. In 2013-14 also, Germany reduced the curfew period for asylum seekers to access labor market from actually 9 months to 3 months after filing an application. And this actually very much helped in integrating the refugees to the job market. The 2016 Integration Act eased asylum seekers and refugees access to work by temporarily suspending the priority check in certain sectors, because before that, if a German national or a national from a country from the EU wanted to work, in that job, they had the priority, but right now it's lifted in many sectors. And another very positive kind of movement in Germany is that on the 3rd of February 2015, the federal government announced that asylum seekers who start an apprenticeship will obtain a guaranteed residence permit limited to the duration of the apprenticeship, but plus 2 additional years for gaining job experience. And some programs and schemes were introduced that specifically target refugees, asylum seekers, and they focus on assessing their skills, for example, which is also very difficult, providing coaching and assistance for job searching and vocational training. In early 2016, also, the German government, along with the German Confederation of Skilled Crafts, set out to create a streamlined nationwide program to prepare refugees for the apprenticeship system. And it's a 2-year program, and it's costs like around $21 million. The program is named Perspectives for Young Refugees, and it provides regional vocational centers with the funds to enroll refugees in a 6-month program that includes training in trades such as metal and electrical work, as well as language and integration classes. But not only in the federal, also by the end of 2015, most of the 16 German federal states, which we call Bundesländer, had launched their own programs and measures to support the labor market integration of asylum seekers and refugees, or at least these were, in preparation. And I wanted to show another here. So as you can see here, this is the rate from 2016, the employment rate in 2013. So for those refugees, asylum seekers who entered Germany or arrived Germany in 2013, now in it's last year, 31% of them found a job. 2014 is 22%, and it's for sure for the 2016 is 6%, but there's this expectancy that in a few years, I mean, it's going to take a long time, but still like maybe half or 50% of, asylum seekers will find a job, but as I said, I mean, it will take a time. And share of the companies with refugees, it's still very low. So 11% of companies already employ refugees, and then only 10% of companies intend to hire refugees in the next 2 years. Lastly, I would like to discuss very briefly the access to higher education of refugees. Now, when it comes to integrating refugees, education plays a central role. More than half of the refugees arriving in Germany are younger than 25. In other words, an age when education is most needed. With funding from the Federal Ministry of Education and Research, the German Academic Exchange Service has developed a set of targeted measures to enable universities to offer those who wish to study and possess sufficient academic qualification access to higher education. So approximately 100 million euros in funding will be available in the coming years, and 27 million euros of which is earmarked for projects in 2016. With this funding, the German Academic Exchange Service has developed an extensive package of long-term measures. This package is comprised of 3 components which form the basis for ensuring access to university study. Recognizing skills and qualifications is the first criteria. The second one is ensuring academic qualification, and in this case of language and subject-related preparation, and supporting integration at universities. In 2016, and the 2016 winter semester, a total of 1,140 refugees were matriculated at German universities, and the majority of them were from Syria. Now, one of the important programs which targets university students called Integrating Refugees in Degree Programs. And foundation courses, comparable programs, and colleges which prepare students at German universities. I mean, there are these 3 components there are some colleges or preparatory colleges and foundation courses which prepare students to their, entrance to the university. So the participants learn fundamental subject-specific knowledge and terminology and develop individual learning strategies and social skills in these courses. And the German federal government has agreed to finance some 2,400 additional places at some of these colleges which prepare students for their university education. In addition, the universities themselves are preparing refugees for admissions to their degree programs as well. Furthermore, many students, German students, are volunteering their time to help refugees become integrated at German universities. Their efforts are contributing to the refugees' academic success and social integration. And, for example, these measures include buddy and mentoring programs at several universities, as well as language learning projects headed by teacher trainers and students of German language studies. And also these projects are funded by the German federal government. And lastly, I mean, just a brief I would like to just very briefly discuss what's happening in German schools, middle schools or high schools, like with the refugee, children. So many German schools have started the initiative or the project called Welcome Classes for refugee students to learn the basics of the German language. They participate in activities such as, sports, music, and visual arts to help them learn. And there are now more than 1,100 welcome classes across this, Berlin's, for example, in Berlin. And there are more than 600 schools which participate in this project. And so I just want to show you here, the participants in the integration courses here, which is, for the Syrians, it's the majority, 114,000. And so. Yeah, thank you. last speaker today is Ahmed Souaiaia. He's an associate professor of religious studies at the University of Iowa, and he has joint appointments in international studies, religious studies, history, and College of Law. At the University of Iowa, he has taught a broad range of courses, including Islamic law, human rights law, religion and politics, women in Islam and the Middle East, Islam in the public sphere, and introduction to Islamic civilization. His primary research areas of interest include social justice in Islamic societies, political dissent in Islam, women in Islamic law, Islamic political theory, modern Islamic thought, and religion and politics in the Islamic civilization. Professor Souaiaia is the author of several books, including Anatomy of Dissent in Islamic Societies, Ibadism and Rebellion, which was published in 2013, and Legitimacy and Contested Justice, Women, Islam, Law and Society, and Society. And he has published several articles in refereed journals, including the Journal of Law and Religion, Muslim World Journal, Journal of Women in the Middle East and the Islamic World, and Muslim World Journal of Human Rights. Ahmed.
Thanks, Yasemin. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. I'll try to make it brief so that you have a chance to maybe ask questions from the various panelists. I'll try to put things in context in relations to the question of refugees, specifically Syrian refugees, and the broader context, especially that we're dealing here in our country, immigration policy and Muslim bans and discussion like that. And heard probably the three were different categories of people moving, displaced people moving, whether willingly or forcefully from their place of residence outside. One is asylum, people who are seeking asylum. It's generally a smallest group. Mostly it's individual cases, and you have to remove yourself out of place of danger into a place of safety and then apply for asylum. It's not a broad category that at least is a subject of national policy. It's usually governed by international law. And the second one is immigration, and you heard also economic immigrants. And then the last category is the refugees. And the Syrians, I think, correctly are identified as refugees, the Syrian refugees, and the Europeans are dealing with them as refugees. And here in the US, is actually considered, mostly it's coming out as a question of immigration, how to control it. And that's a major issue. Every country, I think, have the right to establish national policy on how to admit people, how many people they admit, and what procedures. But in case of refugees, refugees generally are people moving out of their place of residence, their homes, their towns, their cities, their countries, due to usually four causes. And one is genocide. And we've heard a couple examples here. The Armenians as minorities in Syria and in Iraq being forced because of the violence in Syria and Iraq. Then you probably heard also of the Yazidis in Iraq. And these people faced genocide. You hear also about a specific segment of society, and that is women in general are also face totally different set of circumstances, and violence affects them in many, many, many ways compared to men. And then war crimes, and these are, as you can imagine, these are basically where it's a state is the main actor. When you're talking about genocide, it's generally genocide by some government against a segment of the population. When you're dealing with war crimes, also you have a war going on, and then government the parties of this conflict will carry on some violent acts and some crimes. And then you have also crimes against humanity, and this one is also the action of a state, but it doesn't have to be in the context of war. So quickly, in the case of the Syrian refugees, we haven't heard of Syrian refugees before 2012. So you have to understand that, first of all, that's one context. Syria was one of the actually promising countries in terms of economic development, stability, human rights, especially women's rights, especially when you consider the antagonist of the current Syrian government. These are governments who don't even allow women to drive. And then they were lecturing Syrian people and the Syrian government about women's rights and imposing a different worldview on them. Syrian crisis, also you hear also one of the words that I take exception to, and that is it's the civil war. It's not a civil war. You know, civil war because you kind of blame here the Syrian people. And you say the Syrian people are creating conditions to kill one another because they don't get along. That was not the case. They were living peacefully before the Arab Spring, the 2011, and before anything else until regional actors and global actors decided to do something because they're not happy with the government and the policy of that government. And it is, in every sense of the words, a world war. It is a global war. From the minute this, the civil war, this conflict broke, the world was divided into two camps. And the first one that took actually form was this group, fictitious group called the Friends of Syria. 115 countries at some point met, unfortunately, in the country of my birth, in Tunisia, ill-advised by the president at that time, and he brought all these governments in there to, and claimed that he's the friends of, these are the governments that are friends of the Syria or the Syrian people. And then it started to dwindle down from 100 plus countries into 11 countries that they could not even agree on anything after that. And then you have the two superpowers directly involved. They have troops on the ground in Syria. What else? I mean, you need to call it a global war or a world war. And the reason I'm stressing this because it's not really about being nice. It is about being responsible. In the end, there's that Colin Powell's phrase when he went, when they were thinking of going to Iraq, the legal war of Iraq. He's like, you break it, you own it. And you have to ask the question, who broke Syria? And those involved in breaking Syria should take full responsibility, not be nice to the Syrian people, not take full responsibility in making that country and the people of Syria whole again. And every country then, at least proportional to their involvement. If just they match dollar for dollar, every dollar spent on weapons sent to the fighters, the warring parties, they match it, at least to help refugees, and we wouldn't have the problem that the Syrian people have gone through. So I want to at least stress that point, that it's not really about nations' rights to admit or not admit people. This is about a situation that was created. And you have to carry out this context is beyond just Syria. The illegal war in Iraq is the one that destabilized the region. You have to take it back to Afghanistan. When you look, especially in the context of Germany, most of the refugees, you look at the numbers, and it is majority Syrians, then there is the Iraqis, then there is Afghanis. And guess what? These are places where 3 wars happened, and 3 wars where the Western countries were involved in it. And every Western country need to ask the question, how much were we involved in it? And then we have to suck it up and make it up for the Syrian people, the Iraqi people, and Afghani people. I'll just stop it there before I go with the angry.
Thank you, Ahmed. Yeah, I'd like to now ask if you have any questions to any of our panelists. Yes.
Wondering about this relationship between the economic, especially unemployment and youth unemployment, and the sort of right-wing backlash that we've seen from Australia right through here, across Europe. The youth unemployment in sub-Saharan Africa is through the roof on both sides of the Mediterranean. It's very poor. Most of the ex-Soviet Union's really rough shape. And so I don't see how we don't keep having more and more labor in need of work, trying to move to areas where there's safety and work. And so I think we're going to have a lot more people on the move, most of them not legally because they don't have the means and they're not particularly welcome. And I guess I don't see how the EU does hold. I don't see how Brexit, the demands of the British to have these sorts of limits they wanted on the movement of labor and things don't become the norm. And if I'm missing something, what is the fix for the unemployment situation globally?
First, unemployment in Germany has not been the issue for electing. We have the lowest unemployment, including of the youth, since unification, that is 27 years ago. We are exemplary well off within the European Union. I know our situation does not apply to some of the neighbors, but the economic situation, for instance, in Poland is not so bad, and you still have had right-wing shift already much earlier than it now happened, with a certain delay in Germany also. In 2002, the father of Marine Le Pen was very close to winning the first round of the elections in France. 2002, that's 15 years ago. So the unemployment and dissatisfaction with it does not, at least not in the case of Germany, explain the right-wing shift. But I agree with you that there is first a global imbalance that we need to look at, and whether you call it the North-South divide or whether you apply other terms, we still have not enough people in the world being ready to discuss this as a global challenge. Filippo Grandi in the office of the UNHCR needs much more support. The entire section of the world, Russia, China, for them it is not an issue because nobody wants to migrate there. That is very interesting. It is a confrontation of Western capitalist countries where the riches are and where people feel happy and don't want to move, and between countries where the have-nots, for whatever reason, but mostly for economic necessities, want to leave. And if we are fair, but the world is not fair, unfortunately, it is, and it will never be ideal. But if we are fair, if we just, for hypothetical reasons, try to be fair, we have to admit that the migrants who came to this country, who constitute the base of the European migration movement, they did not come here because they were politically or religiously persecuted. The majority, the large majority, came here because they wanted to find economic opportunities, and they found the economic opportunities here. But the great difference, of course, is that this was a vast, empty country, whereas the population density in Europe is quite different. We are more densely populated than many African countries.
You know, okay, just to complement maybe what you're saying, you know, economists have recognized the contributions of migrant populations for a long time, especially in European countries that have had an extremely low birth rate. In fact, they need migration, and they need migrant labor in order to keep their economies and their retirement and social systems working. Okay, this, for whatever reason, I do think election politics, like in this country, are not always rational. And you know, I also very strongly feel that some of the right-wing fervor, especially in Germany, has to do with like regional politics out of maybe former GDR states that are, you know, that have never worked through like Nazi legacies, like in the state of Saxony. But having said that, I do think we all need to actually acknowledge the kind of like economic revitalization and the opportunities that are being provided by very skilled, a huge part of the Syrian refugee crisis. We're not talking about like necessarily poor migrants from the countryside. These are middle-class professionals that have already been trained and that could very easily be presumably integrated into, rather high-level German hospital, educational, et cetera, settings, and potentially also maybe, help the mission of Europe. So I think rather than putting this in terms of liability or burden, this also should be maybe couched as an opportunity. I heard you say that, but I just also really would like to underwrite this. And I do think, in terms of the question of, well, what's happening to mostly post-communist Central and Eastern European countries that I guess have all of a sudden regrounded themselves in their Catholic heritage. I really do think this is a question of democratization and necessity of re-democratization in terms of a kind of like celebration of plurality that just seems to have never happened in a certain way. I don't know. That's my take on it.
Other questions?
I have a question for you, sir. Basically, when the crisis in Syria happened, all the nations, they wanted to support the Free Syrian Army, give them weapons, and they broke off into pieces, and ISIS had weapons. Basically, we have this problem with globalists in the government trying to arm moderate rebels, but they really aren't moderate, and we have this problem which happened in Afghanistan 20 or 30 years ago, the Mujahideen. Basically, what can we do to pressure the government to stop these bad foreign policies?
Great question. I don't know. Vote.
Did vote? They didn't get the globalist hint.
I don't know. I don't know what you need to do. My job is to teach young men and women and try to tell them as many facts as possible, and then put in also a little bit of opinion to get some fire going in their mind. And then hopefully create an educated citizen who will take their vote seriously and consider that. Because history, you just mentioned Afghanistan and Syria. It is, history repeats itself. It's the same model used in Afghanistan, copied, the same players, and applied in Syria. Afghanistan ended up with 9/11, and Syria, we'll have to wait and probably know that. You think these terrorist acts that happen in Europe or in the US, it's not. When you create a volatile situation like that and basically make violence an acceptable tool for solving problems, it will have consequences. And Europe is going to struggle and the US is going to struggle because of this policy that was adopted. And this arming of the moderate is a joke, because I haven't seen any moderates.
Well, right now we're arming the Kurds, and they have the YPG and YPJ, and they're known for terrorist attacks in Turkey, so I'm wondering what the outcome of that can be. And Iran is trying to back them to get their own state.
Yeah.
And like you said about women's rights, I remember looking back in history, most people don't know this, that Afghanistan at one point, 53% or more of the working force were women, and they had full women's rights. It seemed like they had more rights there than in the US, but we decided to back the Mujahideen and broke off to the Taliban just because we wanted to defeat Russia. It was our globalist ideal to defeat communism, now looking at the outcome of what it would be. And it seems like this is a constant problem because we just see Assad, he's maybe a bad guy, but it seems like that for a dictator, a country that has a dictator, they have it pretty good. Even in Aleppo, you see people of different backgrounds that you wouldn't think would mix. The Coptic Christians, Shia, Sunnis, Yazidis, even Jews there. And Now it seems like a constant problem because of globalism. And it seems like history is repeating itself and nobody's really doing anything to solve it.
I just would like to add something, as this point was made by you earlier, and in a way that ties in. There's a certain irony from my point of view in the fact that Germany is taking in the majority of Syrians, because if we believe what you said earlier, that this all goes back to the Iraq War. Germany was one of the few countries that did not go along with Bush. There was a huge problem between the Bush and the Schröder administration at the time. Gerhard Schröder, the then Chancellor of Germany, decided, no, we will stay out of Iraq. There was the coalition of the willing. One of the great supporters was Poland, that now is not taking in any refugees. So if you accept that, right, we did not help provoke this outcome at the time because we did not participate in the Iraq War, but we are sort of paying most for the consequences, if you want. Certainly there is a positive element in that also. It's not all a burden, but I mean, relatively, if you compare our situation with that of our neighbors, and I agree, immigration, Germany, the German population would have not been able to stay stable without the immigration that we've had since the 60s by European countries and lately by migrants from many other regions. But as far as the economic migrant is concerned, you want the qualified labor, yes, and maybe you want also from a humanitarian aspect to help in the country to get the education right, that more people come into qualification and that potentially they can come to your country. But you do not want to do the work starting with preschool, as it were, that should be done in these countries. You wouldn't, on the immigration level, under economic pretext, you want qualified labor, and that should entitle you to choose groups that are more appropriate for your economy than others.
If I may, just one quick comment, because I heard especially the impact of qualified laborers. We have also to be mindful of that policy, what it does to the people from which we're getting these individuals. Yeah. The brain drain is a serious problem in the countries where we take that. And so and if we want to solve the problem, we have to see how our policy impacts the other thing, and that's part of the owning being responsible for it. If we go and get their best engineers, their best doctors, their best servants, their best whatever, the vicious cycle continues to go on, and Europe doesn't solve its problem. Yeah, it may be for a short term, but in the long term it doesn't, unless they create that equilibrium, that dynamic equilibrium between the global south and the global north, and respect the people and make sure that you don't just, because we have the economic advantage, we can pay them as much as we can here in the States. We get these best engineers, best doctors, best everything, and that's why it continues. It perpetuates the same cycle in these countries.
I think you had.
Oh yeah, if I may just add to some of the things that have been said, in terms of the comment that the issue of responsibility in terms of what role should that play in our policy, and this is something that usually, if you just stay in the U.S., does not really come up in the debate. We have debates about, the humanitarian aspect of it, whether, morally we should as human beings, and we have had debates about the security aspect, but responsibility doesn't come up when it is true that the U.S. has played a major role in destabilizing the region and has played a role in this war. And so it would seem that regardless of humanitarian or security considerations, that the U.S. should feel responsible, should do something about refugees and accepting refugees, that it has to, that it's not even that it's something to sort of debate about on a humanitarian basis, given that it is part of the problem that led to the crisis. And just something that I mentioned in my talk, this summit, where I think it was the Geneva one, where they were one of the proposals was to raise the percentage of refugees who are resettled. So resettlement is one of the major solutions to refugee crises, and usually that's where countries of the global north can play a role, given that countries in the global south are the ones that are usually the host countries. They're the one that actually have most of the responsibility, the sort of day-to-day responsibility of accommodating refugees. And so I think this happened in March. And well, before then, when the percentage was 1%, the U.S., even though it's just 1% of refugees are resettled, the U.S. was the country that resettled the most refugees worldwide. That's something that, even though it's a tiny, the numbers as a whole are tiny, but that's something that, the U.S. could actually, sort of was a model in terms of the numbers that it resettled. Fast forward to now, and the Trump administration that we have now, this idea about raising the bar to 10%, that was before the change in administration. What's happened now actually is that the total numbers of refugees who are to be resettled to the U.S. Has been slashed. I think it was from over 100,000 to now only 45,000. So, that policy proposal, it does not have a lot of, there's not a lot of hope around that based on the new administration that we have now. And so it's not even that the U.S. is not taking any responsibility for any of its actions, it actually is just doing as little as it can. And then the other thing is, and I think it's you in the front who raised the question, I do think that economic inequality and migration are related, and that the more unequal we are, I think the more the more population movement we're going to have. So I think that they are interrelated, and something has to be done at that level.
Well, the other thing I've seen when I've been to the Middle East, Lebanon's been taking in refugees, but they treat them like second-class citizens. They put them in Sabra, Shatila, the refugee camp where there's Palestinians. Eventually, the country is going to be 2/3 of refugees. They keep on taking them in at the rate that they are, but they're not properly employing them. And basically, what can be done about that? Because they're trying to vet them from there. Canada's going down to vet refugees in Lebanon, but they're not getting work for so long. They're not getting any skill. All the teachers they have, they're volunteers who rely on that.
Yeah, specifically about Lebanon, there was actually videos where the horrific video, the way they were treating Syrians. Lebanon didn't take refugees. Refugees were dumped on Lebanon. Jordan didn't take refugees. Refugees were dumped on Jordan. Turkey took refugees, most of them because they thought it's going to be a week or two and the Syrian government to be overthrown. And most of them, they were actually families of the fighters, and they ended up actually lasting 7 years, and it's going to probably continue for another 3 years of violence before it all ends up. But here's, again, the main question for refugees, as opposed to other kinds of displaced people, immigrants in general. Immigration probably is an issue that will continue to exist as long as the humans exist because of the human nature. Refugees can be limited. The number of refugees around the world can be limited because if you look at almost 90% of the refugees are caused by war, caused by violence. And so if you address these causes of war, and if countries actually start maybe be forced to take responsibility for the war they create, then you limit the number of refugees. Refugees, we shouldn't even think of settling them. Most Syrians didn't want to leave that country. People think that everybody wants to go to Germany or go to the US. I can speak even for myself. I'm a family of refugees out of Algeria, dumped into Tunisia, then I have to settle somewhere else. And I didn't want to be somewhere else. It's a forced situation. And most refugees feel that way, that they were forcibly displaced by violence and all forms of violence. So if we manage and we solve the problem of violence, I think we can solve the problem of refugees.
But also, with regard to, let's say again, if you stay with Lebanon and the way it's treating refugees, yeah, I mean, yes, you can criticize Lebanon for the conditions in which the refugees are, or the way that they're being treated. But again, how do we put pressure on Lebanon if other countries are not doing their part? And again, those countries that actually can put pressure on Lebanon when they're not accepting any refugees or hardly accepting any refugees. Lebanon, again, for all the criticism that it probably deserves, it is hosting about a number of refugees that's equal to a fourth of its population. And so on the one hand, you can commend it about that, but then if you're going to address the treatment of these refugees, I think it's really hard to put significant pressure when other countries, like the U.S., have accepted about 10,000, and I don't know what percentage that would be relative to the U.S. population, but when the UNHCR is chronically underfunded, this is again where countries of the global north could do their part. When barely any refugees are resettled, this is an area where countries of the global north could do their part. When other countries aren't doing their part, how then do you put pressure on countries like Lebanon about the conditions within which Syrian refugees are living, for example? Not that it makes it okay, but I think it makes it harder to put pressure.
I'd like to thank you very much for your participation. If you have other questions to our panelists, please, you're welcome to ask them. But yeah, thank you so much. Have a good time.